Welcome to our second lecture covering Chapter 11. As you know, this chapter is about third-party contracts. And in our first lecture, we talked about third-party beneficiaries. We discussed how we have two categories of beneficiaries, two large categories, one being the intended beneficiaries who are protected to some extent, have the ability to sue sometimes if their benefit is not conferred. And then we have incidental beneficiaries, and they unfortunately don't have any remedies in the law. Within the category of intended beneficiaries, we have both donee beneficiaries and creditor beneficiaries. Be sure to look at the example that I have posted in the Canvas module that will give you a little bit more explanation about how creditor beneficiary works, because that's the more important category in terms of commercial transactions. And then we are ready for our second category. So we've talked about this one when there's a third-party beneficiary. Now we're going to flip and talk about a category that is at least as important, I would say probably more important legally, to the area of third-party contracts. And this has to do with when one of the parties to the contract, again we're talking about the first party or the second party, the parties who are in privity with each other, in other words, when they transfer either some type of right they have or some type of duty to somebody kind of outside that circle of trust, outside of that contract. And so we'll be talking about this topic for the rest of the chapter. Okay, so there are really two categories. You may have noticed it here. We have the idea of transferring a right, and we have the idea of transferring a duty. And we have different language depending upon whether we're talking about a right or a duty. So let's go through the language. These, you can see there's lots of words in red here, so there's lots of things to kind of play around with. They're not too tricky, but I'll tell you the most challenging aspect of this topic is being able to distinguish an assignment from a delegation. If you can remember the difference, you've got the battle won. The rest is just detail. So let's go through this. So we have an assignment. That is the transfer of property or a right, or even better, to think of it as an asset. So an assignment is a transfer of a property or right from one person to another. When you think about it, you can think about it from the perspective of school. When an instructor gives you an assignment, you're probably not thrilled about it, but you are essentially being given the right to work on this particular item. You are being given that opportunity. The teacher is saying, I'm giving this gift to you of an opportunity for you to develop mastery in this area. The teacher herself or himself doesn't need you to do it, doesn't get any benefit out of you doing it, because he or she already knows the answer. Probably he or she's assigned this in the past, so he or she has lots of examples of successful completions of the assignment. So the teacher isn't benefiting by giving this assignment. It's the student who's benefiting. Maybe doesn't think of it as a benefit, but at the end of the day, that's what's going on there. So that's one way of looking at the term assignment. Of course, the person who gives the assignment is the assignor. We have that OR ending a lot. And of course, when we see the OR ending, we think the person who makes whatever the word is in front of it, makes the assignment. And then we have the assignee, which is, again, the EE ending, the person who receives the assignment. And here is our little mnemonic for this. An assigner assigns assets to the assignee. We could even add that. So if you remember that all of our words start with ASS, and our way of remembering it is the word assets, which also starts with AAS. Now I'm going to tell you something. In test questions, I'm not going to say a transfer of assets because you're going to automatically remember it. In life, they may not call the term an asset, but Obviously, property is an asset. Obviously, a right is an asset. So I'm not going to use the word asset in the problem. You'll have to think about, well, is the word group using the same thing as asset? If it is, we're looking at an assignment. Let's look at our other word, our other category. So we've talked about rights. This is assets. And now we're going to talk about duties. What is this? Well, this is a delegation. In everyday English, we use the word delegation or delegate in two different ways, and I'm just going to talk about that for a second so you have a point of reference. Many times we talk about a manager delegating work to his subordinates or her subordinates, and that fits very closely, in fact I would say it fits very precisely with the definition that we're going to be using here today. Why does the manager delegate the work? Well, he has 100 things that need to happen in his department. He either can't do all the work or doesn't want to do all the work, and so he is distributing it to the people under himself or herself. This is stuff that needs to be done. He's not conferring a favor on his subordinates, although it's possible that these work projects will give the subordinates certain level of experience that may be useful for them. So there may be some indirect benefit, but he's not doing it to be nice. He's doing it because this work has to be done. So it's not an asset that he's distributing. It is a duty, a burden, something that needs to be accomplished. And so when you think about the term delegation, think about that supervisor who is distributing work. Another word that we use in English for this is, or another time we use the word delegation, is when we're talking about some kind of committee or something that is given a task to perform, and they might be sent out to do a certain thing. So for example, you might say that delegation's job is to come up with a new contract in this area, or the delegation's job is to negotiate a settlement or something along those lines. And you can see even in those terms, usually the term delegation does mean the same thing about duty. It's a group of people who've been given a duty, and their whole purpose for this entity is to accomplish whatever that task is. So a delegation is all about duty, and we can see here that fortunately for us, delegation starts with the D, duty starts with the D, delegator and delegatee starts with the D. So we have the Ds. But you know what? If I'm going to be discussing a delegation, I'm probably not going to use the word duty. I'm more likely to use the word obligation or task or something like that. I might even use the word authority here, because if I have a duty, it means also that I have been given whatever authority I need to accomplish that duty. Again, we have these terms with an OR ending, so a delegator is somebody who makes the delegation, gives the assignment. The delegatee is the person who receives the delegation, receives the assignment. We're going to talk about assignments first and delegations, but please don't go into our test not being clear about what types of things qualify as assignments and what types of things qualify as delegations. Okay, so let's talk about that first category, assignments, in more detail. So when an assigner wants to give an assignment, he has to intend to do it right now. I might have something that I want to give somebody. Maybe I'm an elderly person and I want to kind of settle my estate and start distributing my assets in some type of situation. Let me go back here. I am wanting to transfer property from myself to somebody else. But I'm talking about it being accomplished when I die. I might say to my children or my grandchildren, or say, when I die, I want you to have this painting. When I die, I want you to have this piece of furniture or whatever. Well, I haven't actually assigned it at that point because it's not that person's right to take right now. So it only becomes an assignment when there's a present intent to transfer. So when I say, here, take this now. I'm not dead yet, but I want you to have it now. I want you to enjoy it now. Now, usually when there's an assignment, there is also, or I don't say usually, but very commonly, let me put it that way, when there's an assignment, the assignee, the person receiving the assignment, is also taking up an obligation. Now, of course, in the example of the elderly person who's distributing her assets, we don't have that necessarily. But it's possible to imagine that. I might say to you, um, uh, uh, I am going to give you my horse, but I expect you to take very good care of the horse, to put the horse in a nice stable, to properly care for the horse, and give the horse the right amount of food and the right amount of care, and take the horse to the vet and all of those things. And so in that situation, I've given an assignment, but I've also given you a delegation. I've given you some duties to perform. So it's pretty common to have an assignment that is coupled with a delegation. Let's move, though, out of the elderly person who's giving a gift scenario. Let's move to more of a commercial transaction. Let's say that I have some kind of contractual benefit that I'm expected to receive. Most likely in those situations, I also have some obligation that I'm expected to perform. Both parties, as you know, have to contribute consideration for there to be a contract. And so if I'm getting something out of the contract, I'm also giving something to the other party. There's a tit for tat type idea in contract law. Well, sometimes what happens is that either one of the parties doesn't want the assignment anymore, or maybe they don't want to do the or don't want the asset anymore, or don't either can't or don't want to perform the duty. And so sometimes they'll say, you know what, I just like to transfer this whole deal that I've got going on here to somebody else. I want to give that person the goodies, the assets, the assignment, the stuff that I'm getting out of it, but I also want to give them the responsibility to do whatever it is I'm supposed to do. And so that's a very common situation that we have in contracts, that that the party is going to give up the good stuff and the bad stuff. After all, if you're in a commercial transaction, why would you give up the good stuff and still do the bad stuff? That doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. The transfer extinguishes the assigner's right to the thing being transferred. So once I assign my interest in an item, I've washed my hands of it. I'm done with it. I have no rights going forward in it. I can't say, I want to take it back. There are no takebacks. Once I've completed it, I am a stranger to whatever that asset might be. So, do we need to have a writing when we're doing these assets? Well, the statute of frauds can apply to an assignment, but it doesn't automatically apply to an assignment. The issue is, does the nature of the assignment inherently require a writing? So, for example, if I am assigning real property, well, we know under those circumstances that we do need a writing. So we don't need a writing about an assignment simply because it's an assignment. We need a writing because it's one of the categories covered by the statute of frauds. Another thing could be we'll say a good over $500 that would fall under the UCC statute of frauds. So you don't need to have a writing necessarily with an assignment. I always get nervous when I talk about this, though, because that is absolutely the rule. But keep in mind, you want to have a writing. Just because the statute of frauds doesn't require it doesn't mean it's not a really, 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 really good idea. And so don't work under the assumption of, oh gosh, don't need that because statute of frauds doesn't require it. Yeah, you have a deal even without the statute of frauds requiring it, but you want to have a writing. And so every time, or virtually every time, you're going to tell the client, we need to reduce this to writing. So how does the law feel about assignments? Because keep in mind, we'll say Albert and Belinda enter into a contract together. And Belinda decides, you know what, I don't really want to do what I was supposed to do under the contract. I'm in privity with Albert, but I just don't like the deal anymore. And so I want to transfer my goodies from the contract over here to Carl. Well, I mean, can Belinda just do that? I mean, Albert doesn't even know Carl. Albert may not like Carl. Certainly, Albert and Carl aren't in privity, and it may have been very conscious on Albert's part that he wanted to enter into a contract with Belinda and no one else about this topic. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, can Belinda even do that? Well, the short answer is almost certainly yes. We allow free assignment of assets. It's pretty hard for Albert to enter into a contract with Belinda that significantly limits her ability to assign the assets that flow from the contract to somebody outside of privity. We do that because there's lots of financial and commercial reasons why it's very, very useful for our economy to allow free assignment. So if Belinda is getting something out of this deal and she wants to transfer that to somebody else, Albert's probably out of luck. Now, it is true that if it's really important to Albert, Albert can think about his contract language and be very, very careful. It's sometimes possible to limit assignments to at least some extent. Here we go. I'm going to go back here. So an example could be, let's say that Belinda is supposed to mow Albert's lawn for $25, and Albert is supposed to pay Belinda $25 for that. But Belinda happens to owe Carl some money. And so Belinda says to Carl, hey, Carl, you know what? I'm getting $25 a week from Albert. I'll just tell him to pay you directly. Carl's like, oh, okay, works for me. And so Belinda says to Belinda says to Albert, hey, Albert, instead of paying me the $25, I want you to pay it to Carl. Well, and let's say Albert really doesn't like Carl, doesn't really want to deal with Carl, and so he doesn't want to give Carl the money. Is he going to be able to say, no, Belinda, I'm giving you the money, you deal with getting it to Carl? No, probably not, especially not with money, because the idea about money is it's fungible. I mean, a dollar that Albert has looks just like a dollar that Belinda has and that you have and that I have. It's money. It all seems to work exactly the same. Now, Albert doesn't have to hang out with Carl. I mean, Albert can mail it to Carl or perhaps deposit into Carl's account. But especially when we're dealing with money, courts are going to say, yeah, Belinda absolutely can transfer that. Again, because of that whole financing thing. There are some assignments, though, that the courts might say don't make sense. I'll give you an example. Let's say that Belinda mows Albert's lawn, and in exchange for that, Albert has agreed to give Belinda a massage. Albert is a professional masseur, and so Belinda gets that as her compensation for mowing the lawn. Albert likes Belinda, thinks she's a nice person, and enjoys performing this professional service for her. But he can't stand Carl. He doesn't even want to be in the same room with Carl. And so the idea of performing a massage on Carl is very, very repugnant to Albert. you can make the argument that it is a personal service, and the person providing the service, even though it's an asset, the right to have the massage is definitely an asset. You can argue that Belinda can't transfer it because Albert didn't really agree to just give anybody a massage. He agreed to give Belinda the massage. Under those circumstances, though, Albert probably should spend a little bit more time with the contract language to make sure that it's clear that he really just wants to give Belinda the massage, not just anybody the massage. So there are some circumstances where you can limit the assignability. And I'll give another example. Let's say Albert and Belinda are first cousins. Albert has inherited the family china from their great-grandmother. Albert, the china is appraised at $1,000. Albert's in some financial distress. He needs the money. But he doesn't want it to go outside the family. He's okay with Belinda getting it. And so he says to Belinda, listen, Belinda, this is worth $1,000, but I don't want it going outside of our family. I'm willing to sell it to you for $200. You'll get the enjoyment out of it, but I want to limit your ability to sell it to anybody other than us cousins. Belinda signs on the dotted line. She pays $200. Next day, it's on eBay. She's selling it for $1,000. Carl, who isn't a relation of either Albert or Belinda, buys it from Belinda for $950 or whatever. Albert finds out about that. He wants to stop the transaction. He's got a pretty good argument there. It's not something because he made it very clear to her that he really wanted it limited, and there was a logic to why he wanted to have it limited. But honestly, circumstances like the two I just gave, the massage and the family heirloom, are pretty rare in the true business world. And most of the time, Albert really doesn't care who he gives the asset to. It can be Belinda, it can be Carl, it can be the man on the moon, except it's hard to get to the man on the moon, so maybe he wouldn't like that so much. So generally speaking, we have free assignability in a market economy. Now, if you were to go to a planned economy, such as one like China, or used to be the Soviet Union when there was a Soviet Union, assignability might be significantly more limited than we have in free market economies like we have in the United States, most of Latin America, Western Europe, in much of Asia. Okay, so let's go through another scenario. We don't have the car situation anymore, but we're going to first of all look at, we have an initial contract here. So we have Al and Bob are in privity with each other. This is the deal. Al is going to pay Bob $100 in 2 weeks. And Bob is going to give Al a television in 2 weeks. Obviously, it's not a very good television. That's the transaction that they've entered into. As you can see, they're in privity with each other. They have this contract. But you know what? Bob needs the $100 now. He doesn't need it in 2 weeks. And so he finds Ron and he says, listen, Ron, I've got this contract with Al. In 2 weeks, I'm going to get $100. But you know what? I need money now. And so what I'll do is I will assign my right to this income to you if you'll give me $90 now. And you can see how that could be appealing for Ron if Ron feels confident that Al will in fact pay Bob to Ron, or pay the money to Ron in 2 weeks. Ron has just made $10 by paying the money 2 weeks early. I mean, that's a pretty good return on investment. And so Ron agrees to this. He happens to have the money. He gives the money to Bob. And now he is expecting from Al to get the $100 in 2 weeks. That's how that works. So Bob is the assignor because he has assigned his right to this income stream. Not stream really, income payment, I guess you could say, to Ron, who is the assignee. And this, of course, is the assignment. So this is kind of clarifying people's roles under this scenario. Let's go backtrack here and say here. The assignor, Bob, did not transfer his obligation to Ron. So you can see in this example, Bob still has the duty to perform with Al. Ron doesn't have the duty to surrender a television in 2 weeks. Bob has that duty. So in this particular case, we didn't have the situation of the assignee, Ron, also assuming the contractual obligation. This often is the case that both get assigned, both the assignment and the delegation happen together, but it doesn't follow, and it doesn't in this case. Okay, so you may be thinking to yourself, when you look at this example, gosh, I mean, Al's kind of left out of this whole transaction, kind of like Albert was left out of it. How does he know who to pay? How does that even work out? I mean, Al's expecting to pay Bob, but he's really supposed to pay Ron. So what's the mechanism that causes that to change, at least from Al's perspective? And we call this perfecting the assignment. Now, when we use the word perfect in English, we have two meanings associated with it. By far the most common means something without flaws. You know, I might say, oh, I got a perfect grade on that spelling test. There were 10 words and I got all 10 right. I got 100 out of 100. That's a perfect score. Or I might say that I bowled a perfect game in bowling. Every time I bowled, I knocked all the pins down. So that's perfect in the sense of without any flaws. But there's another meaning with the word perfect. If you're a grammarian, you know that there are tenses in English called the perfect tenses. And another way to think about perfect is when something is fully completed. And you can see it has that same idea. I mean, it's not partially completed, it's fully completed. It's perfectly completed. There's nothing left to be done. There is the feeling of, yeah, that is accomplished. Kind of like when you ace the spelling test, that is accomplished. So in some sense, you could perfect a spelling test and flunk it, meaning you've completed it successfully. It's in the past tense, it's historic. Well, that's what we mean, though, when we say perfecting the assignment. We are completing it. We are doing everything we need to for it to be a done deal. And so we're not referring to that first meaning, the getting 100 on the spelling test meaning. So we're not talking about somehow or another making it the most awesome assignment ever. Instead, we're talking about completing it. Okay, so let's think about Ron here. I mean, Ron is the guy who really cares about getting this right because he's the one who's expecting to get the $100. So he's the one who's motivated to get this done. So Ron is going to go out and notify the obligor, which is, in this case, Al, about the assignment. So Ron's going to, as soon as this transaction is completed, or Bob, as soon as Ron pays Bob the $90, Ron is on the phone with Al saying, hey, Al, just to let you know, maybe this has taken a day to complete this, and now we have 13 days. In 13 days, you're not supposed to pay the $100 to Bob, you're supposed to pay it to me. And so that is what Ron is going to be doing. And this perfection releases the assignor, so it gets Bob to drop out of this payment stream. It protects the parties. It protects Ron because Ron's now going to get his $100. It protects Al because, I mean, Al's concerned about, well, gosh, if I pay Ron, I'm also going to have to pay Bob. Am I going to end up paying $200 instead of $100? So by perfecting the assignment, Al is going to be protected from having to pay twice. And it prevents multiple assignments of the same right. We'll talk more about this in a second. I'm just going to put a little star here because this can get interesting. So who is the obligor? Again, we have this OR ending. So this is the person who makes the obligation, who bears that obligation. A contractual party who agreed to do something for the other party. Another term for this would be promisor. What is a promisor? Somebody who makes a promise. Now, going back to our example, both Bob and Al are obligors under the contract. Bob's obligation is to deliver the TV in 2 weeks. Al's obligation is to pay $100 in 2 weeks. So they both are obligors, and because they're supposed to be doing it to the other person, they're both obligees. So Al is an obligee with respect to the TV, and Bob is an obligee with respect to the $100. Of course, this is the part of the transaction we care about in terms of the assignment, because this is the one that's getting assigned. So what happens is Al is still the obligor with respect to this, but we're changing the obligee. The obligee is no longer Bob, because Bob has assigned it to Ron. So now Al's obligation is to Ron, the obligee, the new obligee, who's also the assignee. But Al is still the obligor with respect to this $100. That hasn't changed. And you can see I have a little picture of this to help make sense of all the pieces. So Bob is the obligor with respect to the $100 because he's agreed to the duty of paying $100 in 2 weeks. That's his obligation. The initial obligation was to the first obligee, or was to Bob. He is owed the duty of being paid $100 in 2 weeks. But now he assigns that to Ron. This is the contractual right he's getting assigned. And so now Ron has become the obligee and the assignee because he now has the right to the $100 in 2 weeks. So you can see how that transacts. Again, much of this hopefully is pretty intuitive for you. The big hurdle isn't so much maybe mastering the material as mastering the vocabulary. And so spend a little bit of time working through the vocabulary. As always, I recommend a Quizlet. It's a really neat resource to kind of make sense of the vocabulary, make sense of the concepts. What you might want to first of all do is make sure you understand what's going on, maybe even kind of putting aside the tricky vocabulary, and then try to insert the vocabulary over that, because the vocabulary is what's tricky here in my experience. Okay, so now remember we flagged this one issue. Now we're going to explore that issue in more detail. So let's imagine that Bob isn't the stand-up guy that we know him to be. He's a bit of a snake. Okay, so let's say that Al and Bob enter into this contract on January 1st. And on January 2nd, Bob assigns his right to Ron. And on January 3rd, Bob assigns this same right to $100 to Molly. Now, Molly doesn't know about Ron, and Ron doesn't know about Molly. In fact, Molly assumes that Bob still has the right to this $100 income, just like Ron assumed Bob still had the right to the $100 income. Now, when Bob does assign it to Ron, he did have that right. But when Bob assigns that same right to Molly, obviously Bob didn't have the right. He no longer was entitled to this $100. Molly didn't know. Molly had no way of knowing. Molly didn't do anything wrong. She thinks she's going to get the $100. And maybe under this second assignment, she also paid Bob $90. So maybe Bob has gotten $180 by assigning this twice. Okay, so now we fast forward to January 15th. This is the day that Al and Bob are supposed to do the swap according to the terms of the contract. Bob shows up at Al's place with the TV. And Al says, "Okay, Bob, well, let me run in and get you the $100." And Bob says, "Oh, no, don't give it to me. Someone else will be by to take the $100. I've assigned it to somebody else." Al's like, "Oh, okay, cool." And so Bob goes about his business. And now Ron and Molly happen to show up at exactly the same time. They both knock on the door in unison. And Al comes to the door and he says, "Oh, hi, nice to meet you." Or maybe he knows Ron and Molly. But anyway, they have their introductions, they chat for a second, and Al says, "Are one of y'all here about the assignment that Bob made?" And they both go, "Yes, we're both here for this." And of course, at that moment, they both look at you and go, "What? What's going on here? I'm the one Bob assigned it to." Then the other says, "No, I'm the one Bob assigned it to." And so they both are saying, we are, each of us separately are entitled to $100. Does Al have to pay them each $100? Of course not. Al only agreed to pay Bob $100. So the maximum that Al can be required to pay is $100. So the question is, who gets the $100? Now, there's a few issues. I mean, there's a few solutions that we have to this. I guess one solution would be to split it in half and to give Ron $50 and Molly $50. Another solution would be to give Ron all the $100, because after all, when Bob assigned his interest to the $100 to Ron, he actually had it to assign. I mean, this was a perfectly good legal contract, this assignment. And so because it was a legit transaction at the time it was completed, you can argue that Ron should get the $100. But you could also argue that, gosh, Molly did nothing wrong. I mean, how would she have known that Bob had done this to her? I mean, it could have been reversed. Maybe Bob could have gone to Molly first, and then Ron would be the one who would be out in the cold. So, you really can't argue that Ron is somehow more virtuous or more meritorious than Molly, or that Molly is more virtuous or meritorious than Ron. Now, you might think to yourself, well, gosh, I mean, uh, Ron and Molly ought to be really, really angry at Bob. Well, they probably are. And certainly, whoever doesn't get the $100 can sue Bob, and probably should sue Bob. But uh, the fact that Bob did this probably indicates that Bob doesn't have a lot of money, right? I mean, most people who engage in this type of fraud don't have money and are pretty safe, pretty judgment proof because they don't have money. I mean, Bob may have committed a crime. He might go to the pokey for it, but that doesn't really help Molly or Ron because, again, you can't get blood out of a turnip. If Bob doesn't have money, can't get money out of him. So let's assume that both Ron and Molly realize, and there's really no point of suing Bob. Maybe each of them separately realizes my best shot at getting my $100 is through Al. And so they're both jockeying to be the person who gets the money from Al. And let's consider what the answer to this problem is. What does the law say about who is in line first? So this is that problem we talked about. This prevents multiple assignments of the same right. So the goal here with perfecting the assignment is to stop this from happening, or at least to reduce the likelihood of it happening. Okay, so let's consider the two rules that we have, because this is when multiple assignments of the same right occur. The first is the American rule, but let's not talk about the first, let's not talk about the American rule first. Let's talk about the English rule. The English rule states, by the way, I prefer the English rule. The English rule states that the first assignee to give notice of assignment to the obligor is, actually, let's do the American rule first. Okay. The American rule is the first assignment in time rule. This rule says that Ron is always going to get the money because his happened a day before Molly. Now, the American rule isn't saying Ron always wins versus Molly because the Americans think that Ron is a better person or more virtuous. No, but what the American rule is saying is Bob actually had something to assign at the time he assigned to Ron. When Bob attempted the assignment to Molly, he didn't have anything to assign. Molly, though, isn't in the wrong. She did nothing wrong. But it's just a recognition that Bob actually could assign something here. Okay, so that's the logic behind the American rule. But now let's consider the logic of the English rule. This rule says that the first assignee could be Ron, but it also could be Molly, to give notice of the assignment to the obligor, in this case this is Al, is the party with rights to the contract. So go back here. So let's assume that Bob has, on January 2nd, goes to Ron, enters this deal. Ron gives Bob $90 on January 2nd. January 3rd comes, Bob has the same conversation with Molly. Molly gives Bob $90 on January 3rd. And then on January 4th, Molly contacts Al and says, hey, Al, I am the assignee of this $100. When January 15th comes along, don't give the $100 to Bob, give it to me. And of course, Molly doesn't know about Ron, so she doesn't mention that. On January 5th, Ron calls up Al and says, hey, Al, I'm Ron. Bob has assigned me the $100 you're supposed to pay him on January 15th. Well, of course, Al goes, well, gosh, Ron, I mean, I've already heard from Molly. She says she's the assignee. I confirmed it with Bob, and he agreed. So I'll be giving Molly the $100 because Molly contacted me first. And so under the English rule, with those facts, it's going to be Molly. Now, the English rule could have gone the other way. I mean, it could have been that Ron contacts Al on January 2nd. Right after the transaction's completed, he's calling Al immediately. Hey, Al, just to let you know, 5 minutes ago, Bob left my house. I paid him $90. I'm entitled to the $100 on January 15th. Al goes, okay, cool. See you then. And so when Bob enters into this transaction with Molly, then Molly maybe calls right after the transaction is done on January 3rd. But when she calls Al, Al says, I'm sorry, Molly, you called me a day too late. I already talked to Ron before. So you can see the English rule, could provide for either Ron or Molly to get the assignment. The American rule is going to limit it to just that first person. So why do I prefer the English rule? Well, between Ron and Molly, we really don't have a preference. I mean, they're equally innocent in this transaction. But there's only really one thing they can do under these circumstances, and that is they can be super responsible and contact Al immediately about the assignment. Now, Ron has a head start. Because, I mean, obviously Bob contacts him first. And so he has, it's almost like a foot race. He's started his, let's say it's a marathon and it's going to take a few hours to run it, but he's got a 30-minute head start on Molly. So probably, if he's smart, he's going to be able to make that call to Al before Molly. But if he's not conscientious, not careful, not attention to detail, Molly could beat him. And since we really don't prefer Ron or Molly because of any kind of virtue idea, if Molly is first to make the call, then it seems that it's reasonable that she should reap the benefit. The other reason that the English rule is meritorious is, let's say that Molly shows up, again, January 15th, she shows up at 2 p.m. Al sees the paperwork Molly has, gives her the $100. Molly leaves with $100. Then Ron shows up at 3 p.m. I mean, Ron didn't know about Molly. He assumed there was no particular need to rush. He had no reason to think Bob was pulling this kind of a shenanigan. And so Ron says, okay, ready for my $100. And Al's like, I already gave it to Molly. Well, under the American rule, Al's in a bit of a pickle. He paid the wrong person. He was supposed to pay Ron. It's not Al's fault, but still, he made an incorrect payment. And so you can see how the American rule can result in the wrong person being paid. And it also doesn't reward the very conscientious person. So the English rule has some advantages over the American rule, but as you can tell probably by the name, Most jurisdictions in the United States use the American rule. Not 100%, but most, and that's why it got its name. I've tried to find the answer to this question, whether Texas follows the American rule or the English rule, and I haven't been successful. So if you find the answer, please send me the case, and I will be glad to post that for that. But for the purpose of this class, I'm not going to ask that you know what the rule is in Texas. Obviously, in this situation, we're not dealing with Rhonda here, so don't worry about Rhonda. In our story, we have Molly instead of Rhonda. Molly is our second assignee. So it's important under those circumstances to know whether we're following the American rule or the English rule. Okay, so let's consider the issue of warranties. We haven't really talked about warranties yet. We will talk about those later in the course, but let's focus on this for a second. So what warranties does the assignor give to the assignee? So again, going back to our scenario, this is Bob. So let's assume that there's no Molly anymore, okay? So we're just talking about, Bob's legit this time. He's not doing any shenanigans. What warranties is Bob giving to Ron about this asset? Well, he's saying that you could say warranties is like a promise. Is another kind of word for this. The assigner is legally entitled to transfer its right. So when Bob assigns his interest to this $100, he's saying, listen, right now I'm entitled to do this, Ron. That was, of course, the problem with the Molly transaction. Bob wasn't entitled to do this with Molly, but he is certainly entitled to do it with Ron. And so that's one promise or warranty that Bob would be giving to Ron. And that also there are no valid defenses against this assigned right. So for example, there's no argument that Al's going to be able to have to Ron's going to Al and saying, hey, give me the $100. There's no language in the contract that's going to make this assignment ineffective. So what promises is Ron, the assignee, making to the assignor? And that would be that the assignee is going to make complete and satisfactory performance if performance is required. Now, we can see that in this case, the only performance is the payment of $90. Now, I suppose that Ron is warranting that this isn't counterfeit money. But it could be another scenario where Ron is agreeing to, mow Bob's lawn or something along those lines. And so then Ron is saying, I'm going to do a good job. I'm not going to, skip whole sections of the yard, or I'm not going to forget to edge or forget to pick up the trimmings or whatever. I promise to do a complete and full job. So the general rule is that assignments can be freely assigned. We already talked about that. But here are some exceptions. The courts will likely not allow an assignment only if the assignment is precluded by the contract. So you actually have to look at the language. So obviously you're going to want it to be in writing. And you have one of these qualifications. So if it just has the language in the contract and you don't have one of these, the court's probably going to still let the assignment. So you just need one of these though. So I'm just going to put or here so we can keep track of this. The contract involves a unique duty, like the back massage, or the assignment will impair the performance. For example, let's say, going back to the back example scenario, or let's say that the assignment was Al wasn't supposed to pay money, but was supposed to mow Bob's yard. But you know what? Ron's yard is 4 counties over. And Al actually lives next door to Bob, so it's really not that big of a deal for Al to go to Bob's yard and to mow it. There's no transportation time, essentially. It takes him 30 minutes to mow the yard, he's done. But to mow Ron's yard, it's going to take him, an hour to get there, maybe 2 hours to get there. hour or two to get back. He's going to have all that time, the gas he's going to use up. It's a pretty different, I mean, even if Ron's yard is the same size and the same level of difficulty in terms of mowing, it's materially more burdensome on Al to expect Al to mow Ron's yard. So that would be an example of a situation where we wouldn't have assignment. Or the services described in the contract require particular talent, expertise, or profession. Okay, so let's say that well, we'll save that when we get to delegation. Let's just save that particular topic. That fits more in with the delegation. So keep this in mind. We will explore this topic in a little bit more detail when we get to our next topic. So again, the inclination of courts are very much to honor assignments. That is, again, how many businesses are financed, and so it's important that we allow this to happen most of the time. So the situations, and so the things the courts are looking for is the clause in the contract very specific about what it prohibits? If the language can be interpreted to allow the assignment or maybe not to allow the assignment, the court is going to be much more inclined to allow the assignment. Anti-assignment clauses aren't going to be effective at all under certain circumstances, even if they're well written, and otherwise would be enforceable. An example would be in the bankruptcy scenario. We already talked about how money's fungible. It's interchangeable, and so that's never going to be permitted to have a limitation on an assignment. So our next topic is going to be delegations in contracts. I start my day by making a list of everything I need to do and who I can get to do it for me. That's a neat way of thinking about delegations. This is a manager. He has subordinates who are unfortunately going to be responsible for his work. So we will start our next lecture and we will cover in our third lecture the topic of delegation. So we've covered at this point third-party beneficiaries and assignments, and we have this final topic, delegations, for our last lecture. Thank you for your attention. As always, if you have questions, please feel free to come to my office hours or send me an email. My email is cgroover@collin.edu. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Thanks for your attention.